CBC, the Liberals, and reality. I'm Brian Lilley with TheRebel.media. In politics and media, there's myths, and then there's reality. Now, one of the myths would be that the Liberals love the state broadcaster, that they're just waiting to give them everything they want, and it's just those big, bad, mean conservatives that won't give CBC all the money that they need over and above their $1.1 billion, their cable subscription fees, their, share of the Canadian Media Fund, and everything else that they get. But that's what it is. It is a myth. It's not based in reality, never has been. For a start, if you remember back to the Chretien years, the Chretien Liberals cut CBC by more than Preston Manning and his Reform Party ever proposed. That's how much it is. And then there's this, a pile of documents that I received from 1994. See, after 20 years, cabinet documents can be released, and what I'm holding is a stack of cabinet documents from April and May of that year, detailing the Chretien government's attempts to, rectify CBC. They knew that the state broadcaster was in trouble in what they called a multi-channel universe. They knew that something needed to be done. But exactly what? Well, first off, let me just point out another myth, that it's the Conservatives that are obsessed with the media and media reaction and sketching out how everything has to be done. This document is called a communication synopsis. It talks about the goals of their announcement, their expected impact, the types of headlines that they might get, the messages that the government will put out, the activities to do, and how to sustain the message of reviving CBC and their plans for changing it in the multi-channel universe. Here's another example of how the myth differs from reality, and that is that the Liberals admitted that they and the public didn't want to give CBC more money. On page 44 of this cabinet document release, it says, "It is clear to most Canadians that in the current economic context, the government cannot afford to further augment the appropriations accorded to the CBC." This is before the austerity cuts of the Martin Chretien years had even begun. And they're saying, no more money for CBC. Then here's something that hits a little close to home for me. The whole issue of, should Cabinet interfere in a CRTC decision? Should Cabinet ensure that certain channels get mandatory carriage? You remember that's part of what Sun News's fight was all about. Our channel couldn't get the same treatment as CBC and CTV. Well, back in 1994, CBC had just started a specialty cable channel called RDI, Réseau des Informations. It's the French news world, essentially. And it wasn't given mandatory carriage in English Canada. And Cabinet actually talked about whether they should interfere and reverse this. Quoting from the Cabinet documents, "In the discussion that followed, the Prime Minister stated that there were many Anglophone people who would be interested in the service. He thought that the service should be available across the country, not merely extended to northern New Brunswick and northern Ontario." Other ministers chimed in that it should be available across the country, that if it wasn't, the Bloc Québécois could use this as a campaign issue for the looming referendum. Now, what was their decision? Not to interfere, but to revisit it if the cable companies refused to make it mandatory. A little bit of arm twisting by the Cabinet on private enterprise. Do what we say, or we'll make you do it. Cabinet also considered reversing another CRTC decision that's contained in these documents, and that's on the issue of Bravo and A&D. These were two, at the time, new arts channels designed to showcase Canadian arts and culture, but the arts and culture community didn't think they were going to be doing enough, and they wanted Cabinet to shut them down. They talked about doing that and how they would do it in these documents, despite the CRTC being an allegedly arm's-length organization. This doesn't make the Chretien Liberals of 20 years ago any better or any worse than the current government. Doesn't make them any better or worse than future governments. It's just showing that the myth and the reality don't always mesh. And when it comes to the state broadcaster and the supporters of them and their claims that it's just the big bad meanie Harperites that are out to get them, think again and check the history books, which tell a different story.